Good morning. Welcome. Glad to have everybody here this morning. We are kicking off a new message series this morning called Alongside the Urgency of Community. Starting that off, and maybe that's a word, that community word is one you feel like you've heard a bit over some past weeks and such. But there's a reason for that and why that's repeated and why that's important. And we're going to get into that in this series a bit, okay? I mean, the reality is we're living in the hyper-digital age right now. Daily, we are flooded with more information than we can ever file, more news than we can process, more product advertisements and business promotions than we can read, more online contact points and cyber connections that we could ever keep track of or maintain. And yet, we are the loneliest and most isolated we have ever been as a nation. Most Americans scarcely know their neighbors. We're working increasingly longer hours, and our 24/7 smartphone connectivity makes it harder to disconnect from our work duties. When we do find little snippets of time in between work and sleep, we turn to our screens, and we compare the lowest and darkest points of our personal lives to the finest and most manicured social media presentations of others' exterior lives. As parents, we have overcommitted our children to keep them occupied, telling ourselves that this will help them connect more. Maybe it's in part to help us quell guilt from our own busyness. And kids' time and kids' freedom are exponentially more committed away than they have ever been. Yet we and they, despite these supposed connections, we are experiencing unprecedented numbers of cases of anxiety, depression, and social isolation diagnoses. We crave real connections with real people. We long for genuineness, for honesty, for authentic friendships. We were wired to experience life with others, to know and to be known, as the phrase goes. And yet our quality of life and our emotional stability is suffering. 3 out of 5 Americans say they often or always feel like their social connections and relationships are simply not meaningful. How is that even possible? With all of those connections, seeming connections, how is it possible that our psychological and emotional and mental health is going downhill? It's kind of crazy. It's crazy to think that good connections, meaningful relationships, and community carry more weight than other healthy life choices in a lot of ways. You look at someone like, this is a classic example, Winston Churchill, right? He was notorious for having a horrible diet, for having a cigar in his mouth all of the time. He lived to be 90-some. And he was asked at one point, how do you keep going? Is it exercise? And he said, this was kind of a famous quote, he said, "The only exercise I get is being a pallbearer for my friends who exercised." That was his quote. Or the verse that I like to do in thinking about community, this is from 1 Harrington 3:16. It says, "Better to share a cheeseburger with friends than a salad all alone." That's my thing. Anyway, so we're depressed, we're isolated, our emotional and psychological health is going downhill because of a lack of community. Aren't you so glad you came this morning for this uplifting message? But listen, we all need community. We all have a little voice on constant repeat in our heads that reminds us how much we need one another in our lives. No matter how much we try to convince ourselves that we have built our own empire of self-sufficiency and that we don't need anyone's help, we still have the need. We've just learned to stop listening to that little reminder voice. This makes me think a bit of the movie classic Cars. I've never done this with this movie, but I'm just going to check. If you've seen the movie Cars, raise your hand. All right, see, we seem to be crossing generational boundaries here. That's good. Now, it's a bit old, but my kids loved that movie when they were young. I could kind of be considered an expert because I've probably watched that movie 150 times, not by choice. But anyway, the movie's kind of a classic. You got this feisty young race car, Lightning McQueen. He is stubborn, he's arrogant, and he needs no one to achieve the lofty heights that he imagines for himself. But over the course of the movie, he discovers that he's fallible, and through building community and friendships with a small-town host of checkered characters, he learns about community and about how we can all be better by depending on one another. McQueen is actually kind of a quintessential jerk. That's how he's cast in the movie when we first see him. But we learn to love him because we can identify with him. And the reason we can identify with him is because he is us. He boldly talks and acts out the things that we often just think about in our heads. He thinks he can do it all, that he doesn't really need anyone. And through the course of the movie, he learns otherwise. He learns the value of friendships, of life shared with other people, of lives interconnected and feeding into one another. I always think it's kind of interesting in stories like that it's not so much the success of a character that draws us to them, that endears us to them. It's their humanity, right? It's their failures and the difficulties that they kind of navigate through and how they learn from them. That's what makes us want to cheer for them. It's a natural human tendency. And so then I started thinking that in this world of fictional feel-good story characters, almost every character like that has a sidekick, someone that they're doing life with. Every story character has somebody that's going through life and struggles with them. I mean, let's think about this for a minute, about some famous pairs. We just talked about the Pixar classic Cars. You got McQueen and Mater, right? That's the duo. But there's lots more through lots of movies and TV shows and stories through pop culture. If you stay with the Pixar theme, you got Woody and Buzz, right? If you remember those. Another classic duo. If you go back a lot farther, but before that, you got Fred Flintstone, who had Barney Rubble, right? You got Batman, who had Robin. Of course, Bert had Ernie. And if you really want to stretch it, you could say Dora has Boots. Any parents of preschoolers? Come on, you got to recognize that, yes? All right. But it goes on and on. You got Wayne had Garth. Laurel had, okay, we can do this. Napoleon had Pedro. Oh, come on, Napoleon Dynamite fans here. The Lone Ranger had, yes. Laverne had, oh, good, I'm in the right group of people here. And then Ren had Stimpy. Okay, you got to have that in there. Simon had, and of course Hall had, yes, that's a sweet mustache right there. You just got to say that. And of course, finally, Dumb had Dumber, right? All of them, famous duos, they wrote their stories together. No one stood alone. But I mean, look, even when we're looking across the pages of the Bible, most heroes in the Bible actually had somebody that stood with them. That was with them through both their heroic and their not so heroic times. David had Jonathan. Elijah had Elisha. Joshua had Caleb. Paul had Barnabas. Even Jesus shared intimate community with his closest disciples. And then there's incredible King Solomon. Who did he have? King Solomon, among the richest and most powerful men to walk planet Earth. Solomon had exactly. Solomon was smart. He was rich. He was handsome, charismatic, powerful, universally famous. He was a king's king. He was the envy of all the nations, and still, Solomon was somehow the poster child of loneliness and isolation. He had very little meaningful connection in his life. Now, maybe you're a little bit familiar with him and some of his Bible history, and you might be saying, hold on, wait a second. Haven't I read before that he threw all kinds of lavish parties with an incredible number of people? He had people all around him all the time. I mean, didn't he have the admiration of millions of fans, even world leaders? And didn't the guy have like 700 wives and 300 mistresses? You're telling me that guy was lonely? Absolutely. And he was miserable because real connectedness is not the same as just knowing a bunch of people or being in the presence of a bunch of people. That's kind of where we started the message. People can have all kinds of contacts in their network. You can have thousands of followers on Instagram or friends on Facebook and still not have any meaningful connection with anyone. Well, how do we know this about Solomon? We know this because Solomon kept a kind of a journal of sorts. It's kind of a mixture of of a personal journal mixed together with like a essay of things he'd learned about life, all wrapped into one book. It's called the Book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. And Solomon wrote about his journey to success, and he ends up reflecting that he was lonely and empty because he had no meaningful relationships. He never poured any time or energy to cultivate into those. He put his time or energy into everything else. He believed the lie that he could do it alone, that you don't really need anyone. And he's kind of saying to us, let me tell you what you're going to find at the end of your self-guided pursuits if you're not careful. You're going to find isolation and loneliness, and it stinks. And this is why I wanted to start off this message series with a message called The Danger of Isolation. Now, most of us know the value of human connectedness. It's been all over the news. It's one of the most proven by research. We know more about the value of connection and the destructiveness of isolation than just about any other human dynamic like that. There is tons of research that shows when people have strong friendships, have strong support systems around them, that they are physically healthier. That's what I started to talk about at the very beginning. There was a recent study, you may have seen this. This was all over the news maybe about a half a year ago, talking about how this epidemic affects our physical health. It found that a life of loneliness and isolation from true and honest community is the equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And that it was more lethal, this is just recently past this, has passed obesity as being more lethal. And it carries a 50% greater chance of early death. This is not a fairy tale anymore. It's those who go through life with strong support systems and honest friendships and relationships, on average, they have stronger immune systems. Their biologies respond to medical treatment better. They are emotionally healthier. They have less stress and depression and anxiety. They're more likely to succeed at making changes in life and setting and meeting goals, and on it goes. Everything that we do is affected by the quality and the level of connection, community, and support systems that we have in our lives. This is a repeating real-life evidence theme in science and in medical fields and psychology. It's confirming this stuff over and over. We need lives with true community and support. It's not just a nice little idea anymore. It's real life. There's an illustration I've used before. You may remember this, but it bears repeating in this message. Back in the world before kids, Debbie and I was a youth pastor here, lived over at that house just like we now do again, and we had a membership at Club Julian, the 24-hour fitness center over there off McKnight Road. 24 hours. Debbie was working at PPG at the time. We kind of kept odd hours here and there, but we would go over there and we joined Club Julian to try to get started life on the right foot and keep ourselves healthy, all that stuff. And it kind of opened our eyes a little bit to the subculture of health clubs. You have a couple different types of people that go there. You have the types that got a membership and they make sure that everybody sees their card, but they never really go. They just like to talk about it. Oh yeah, have you ever heard of Club Julian? Because I got a membership there. That's right, I do. But anyway, that's kind of the first tier. The second tier of people is those that do go with a degree of regularity, but when they go, they're more or less doing it alone. That was what Debbie and I would do. We'd kind of get there early in the morning, real early, still dark. And we would kind of go our separate ways, and she would do some of the cardio equipment. I'd go in with the weights. But here's what would invariably happen. I'd go in there, and I'd sit down on one of the press machines and be like, I'm really tired. I'd do a few things, and I realize I don't have any strength here because it's 4:45 in the morning. So then I'd slip off into the hot tub for a little bit and maybe go over to the juice bar and get a smoothie, maybe go back to the hot tub a little more. And then at 6:10 a.m., you're walking out of the health club with the towel around your neck, and people are just arriving as dawn cracks, and they're like, look at that guy, that's dedication. But they had no idea I'd been sleeping on the chest press for 45 minutes. But then there's a third type that go. They're the ones that go regularly, and they do it with someone else. And that's that person that's standing right there with them, that's getting on their case if they've been doing the same number of weights and reps for 6 months. Or the person that says, come on, you can get this last one out. I'm right here. You can do it. But it's the same person that's also ready to catch if you fall, ready to help you out. That's a picture of how we were meant to live life. Health and success and balance at just about anything is found in shared community and mutual support. The researched facts are all around us. But thousands of years prior to all these studies and all this research, Solomon came to the same conclusion. He conducted his own research, and he wrote down in his findings from his lonely spot at the top. Here's what he says, Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling? He asked himself. Why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. Even well before that, in fact, at the very dawn of creation, have you ever noticed this? We read the account of creation in Genesis, and it goes through everything that had been created. God made the trees and the forests and the animals to wander the earth and the sun to light the day and so on. And each verse ends with the phrase, and God saw that it was good. But have you ever thought about the one exception to that? God had created Adam, created mankind. And when he's going back over that, when that is mentioned, what does it say in Genesis 2:18? The Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. You see, Solomon's journal findings were not new. Loneliness and isolation wasn't new. God identified it at the very beginning. Eastern Orthodox Bishop Kallistos Ware writes this, none of us alone is fully an authentic person, but merely an individual, a bare unit as recorded in the census. Egocentricity is the death of true personhood. Each becomes a real person only through entering into relationships with other persons, through living for them and in them. There can be no man, so it has been rightly said, until there are two men in community. Only in relationship with others can we fully understand who God has made us to be. Let me say that again. Only in relationship with others can we fully understand who God has made us to be. That's where Solomon ends up. He realizes that. Let's look at how he continued to reason through it and where his observations landed him. Continuing in verse 9. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. Let's just be abundantly clear on this, okay? Community, meaningful connection with each other and sharing life in real ways with each other, with real people, even finding our value and our identity in that community, it is biblical. It is how God created us as human beings, and it is essential for understanding health in faith, in church, and it's crucial for relational health in everything we do. We are not islands. I do realize something. I realize that this repeated idea of shared and interconnected lives seems to kind of be at odds a little bit with our Americanized Western culture idea of rugged individualism. It's what makes our country great, right? Baseball and apple pie and all that stuff. Now, it's very true. Here in the United States, we have made incredible strides over generations at valuing the individual, upholding and dignifying the right and the care of individual personhood and uniqueness. But as our opening statistics have shown us, that American mantra has come with a high cost at times. The cost of the value of true community. The cost of failing to experience that our lives can be made richer and more meaningful through the ways they are interconnected and shared. Just think about this. Think about the younger adults in the adult workforce right now, millennials. I know it's fashionable to insult them. It's always fashionable to insult the young up-and-coming generation, always has been, and they always get the same words that are assigned to them, lazy, clueless, entitled, whatever. It happened with my generation, it happened with yours, it's just what we do. But consider this young generation, the current young adult workforce, they have felt the cost of this epidemic. They have seen the emotional, financial, and psychological fallout of a culture that has prized self to the exclusion of community. They've seen and felt the collateral damage through watching their parents' generation strive harder and harder to feed the ever-increasing ferocious appetite of the American dream, only to find that promise empty of any true fulfillment. And despite having grown up in the internet-dominated world, so many of them are keenly aware of the lack of true connection, lack of meaningful community around them. The things that the older generations get on their case about are often just desperate attempts to find meaningful community. Because things like living with your parents longer, maybe because there's real relationships there. Enjoying local artisan and craft foods and small businesses because they feel like they're connecting with their community. They're contributing to their community. It's attempts to reach out and bridge connections where they have felt there has been none. Get this, though. This young workforce, this age bracket, gives of their money and their free time statistically more than any other age group to support local missions and charitable organizations. All of this because they're tired of seeing the world in front of them crumbling under the weight of a lack of true community. Maybe remember that the next time we want to throw out another stereotype. It's affecting our medical care costs and our health insurance rates in profound ways. Don't take my word for this. There's studies and articles about this all over the place. They come out every week, it seems. There are studies and articles that are pointing continually to how much a lack of connectedness in our relationships is physically and emotionally harming us. Our human pursuit of self-reliance and trying to do life alone is literally killing us and is affecting our country's economic infrastructure. Let me slow down and say that again, because this is serious business. Isolation, loneliness, and living in self-reliance instead of community, it has gotten so dire that it is affecting our country's economic infrastructure. Let that sink in. So church, when I come up here and I talk about the importance of genuine community and meaningful connection with each other, and maybe you roll your eyes a little bit and say, Ethan, we've heard this before, we get it, you're like a broken record. Do you see why? Our lives, our well-being, our very souls, in a sense, are at stake. Doing life relying upon our own merits and rugged individualism and the classic Pittsburgh working-class self-made man ideology that says, I got here by my own grit and hard work, and I don't need any handouts from anyone. That's not how God designed us. It's not how He designed us to live person to person. It's not how He designed His church, and it's not how He designed us to live in relationship with Him. Proverbs has plenty to say about this, but look at these two verses. Proverbs 18:1. Loners who care only for themselves spit on the common good. Proverbs can be so curt and to the point. I love it. And the classic Proverbs 3:5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will direct your paths. A problem we run into, though, in our culture is the term faith. When we think about faith, that often means a little more than just my personal relationship with God. And sometimes in that context, God sometimes merely means the God of my understanding. Now, for those that have made Jesus their Lord and are following Him with their lives, of course there is a personal component to it, an intimate relationship with Jesus Christ. That is a personal thing. But it most certainly is not just a personal thing. That's our American me-centric worldview betraying us if we think it is. It's never just been about me and my faith or you and your faith. There is so much more because God's vision of salvation is way more than just some sort of religious amnesty program that you hit the tag on the wall on your way out to pay your dues before the deadline arrives. God's plan for humankind has always been about finding our identity and our value in true community. Communion with God Himself through His Son Jesus, and interdependent community through meaningful relationships with each other that depend on one another. That is how we were created. That is the consistent picture we see from the beginning of creation. And that is where we find our identity, our value, our meaning, our purpose, and our fulfillment. Psalm 133, verses 1 and 3 says this: "How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. For there the Lord bestows his blessing, even life forevermore." This wasn't just those psalmists' observations. It wasn't just Adam and the creation story or Solomon's findings. Look what Jesus himself says when he's encouraging his disciples in Matthew 18:20. He says, "For where there are two or more gathered in my name, there I am with them." A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. It's the biblical message of God's heart and design throughout Scripture. People, God. 3 strands. Real life people interconnected and leaning on God and his wisdom to direct and shine light on their paths in the process. 3 strands. There's your simple arithmetic formula for the kind of God-ordained community that we're striving for here at this church. You've heard me say this before. We all have a built-in need to be a part of something that's bigger than ourselves. It's healthy for us, and it's healthy for the thing that we're giving ourselves to. Look again at this passage in Acts from a couple of weeks ago, this picture of the early church, Acts 2:44 through 47. And the church met together constantly and shared everything they had. They worshiped together at the temple each day. They met in each other's homes for meals and shared their generosity. It goes on to say, and each day the Lord added to their group those who discovered Jesus. It happened through relationships, through sharing life, eating food, worshiping God, and being real with each other, not through living lives of self-reliance, facades, and image management. It was real. And that is the church that God designed. And that's the church that we want to be here. It's why you've been hearing so much about things like Man Camp that Katie mentioned. This is just a 24-hour guys' getaway with some guys from a couple of other area Christian churches to connect more deeply with each other and with God. Today is the deadline to sign up. Midnight tonight it closes. So if you're one of those that just sits on your rear end and waits till the last minute, today is you, okay? This is the deadline to sign up. You can do it on your phone on our website right here today if you want. But it's also why you've heard so much about life groups. Those kick off this week. They're weekly small groups that have God-anchored relationships at their core. We encourage everyone who comes here regularly to be a part of one of those. Just like we encourage everyone who comes here regularly to be a part of a serving team. It's the give and take. It's all about community. We've had those Get Involved cards available every Sunday in September. Most of you have had a chance to fill those out, and communication to those sign-ups is ongoing. Hopefully some of that has been peppered in your inbox. If you have not yet filled out a Get Involved card, it's a half sheet of paper on cardstock. There are several in every pew. If you have not yet filled one out, I am urging you to do that. It's an opportunity to get plugged into ways to serve and into life groups and study groups. Fill that out and drop it in the basket on the resource table as you head out, okay? And each day, the Lord added to their group who discovered Jesus. That's the reason for all this stuff. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. That's why North Hills Christian Church exists and why any church is meant to exist, for people to discover Jesus. We desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, bigger than any one of us can be on our own. And so we engage in community, back and forth, give and take community that aims to look as much like Jesus as possible. Look at this closing picture of the God whose mission we unite behind. Psalm 68. Father to the fatherless, defender of widows, this is God, whose dwelling is holy. God places the lonely in families. He sets the prisoners free and gives them joy. There is some great historical stuff there. When the psalmist writes about placing the lonely in families and setting prisoners free, there were practices in the Old Testament, in the Israel nation, that are talked about in other parts of the Old Testament. Families aren't necessarily talking about nuclear families of 3.5 people in a suburban 3-bedroom home. Okay, this is Jewish culture talking about the greater body of community and belonging. The clan, the extended religious family. And this passage paints the picture of a God who puts practices in place for his people to provide connection and community and true joy and freedom from being wounded outsiders, from their isolation and the pains and the debts of their past. That's what the church can be. That's still God's heart. That's what followers of Jesus can be to the community around them. It's what life groups can be. God is a God who has always been in the business of pointing us, His beloved creation, back to lives of restored, caring relationships with Him and with one another. It's what we see these shadows of throughout the Old Testament, and it's what God did through His Son, Jesus Christ, when He freed us from being prisoners of sin once and for all on that cross. Make sure you join us next week. We're going to be talking about that connection that God invites us into in a relationship with Him. But we're going to remember the cross, the victory on that cross, by taking communion together this morning. This is a time every week. We do this every week to kind of center our hearts and minds. And we do it because Jesus, when He was with His disciples, they took communion together. He said, "This is my body. This is my blood given for you, shed for you. Do this whenever you get together to remember me." And so that's what we do. And when we do that today, I plead with you to remember that this was a way that God reached out to all of us who were sin-filled and broken and had us be united together as broken people under the body and blood of His Son. When we come to the table, we come messy. We come from different histories and textures and experiences, good and bad. And God says, "You are united at this table of mine. The slate is clean. We're in this together." And so we're going to take communion. And if you're here this morning and you're not sure where you stand with the whole God piece, that's fine. We're glad you're here. Feel free to just let the plates pass by you as they come and just use this time to reflect. But if you've put your trust in Jesus and you follow Him, regardless of how well you think you've done it, take the bread and take the juice as they're passed. And be reminded of that sense of community. Community with one another that unites us in our brokenness, and communion with the God who paid such a price for us, the price of His only Son. Let's pray and then we'll take communion.